Imagine slathering rotting fish guts on everything you eat like ketchup, because who needs Heinz when you've got decay in a jar? Or picture dining on a peacock that's been dressed back up in its own feathers, like the world's worst attempt at food cosplay. Welcome to the weirdest foods in history. From Roman condiments that could fumigate a stadium to Viking shark meat so toxic it basically needed a detox spa day underground before anyone dared to eat it. Hey friends, tonight we're diving into the absolutely bizarre things our ancestors considered delicious. From Egyptian bread that literally ground down their teeth to Chinese eggs aged until they turned black as jewels. Tell me in the comments, what's the weirdest thing you've ever eaten, and would you be brave enough to try any of tonight's menu items? What we're about to discover isn't just a collection of gross-out moments from the past. These foods tell stories of survival, cultural exchange, social status, and the remarkable human ability to find sustenance in the most unlikely places. Some of these dishes were delicacies for the wealthy, others were last resorts for the starving, and a few were simply the result of someone, somewhere, deciding that yes, this strange thing definitely belongs in my mouth. So dim the lights, maybe push that late-night snack a little further away, and let's begin our exploration of history's most bewildering banquet. Chapter 1. The Roman delicacy that made emperors weep. Let's start our journey in ancient Rome, where the wealthy had developed such refined tastes that they needed increasingly exotic foods to impress their dinner guests. Enter garum, a condiment so beloved by Romans that they put it on absolutely everything, and so revolting by modern standards that it would probably violate several health codes and possibly international treaties. Garum was essentially fermented fish sauce, but calling it that is like calling a hurricane a light breeze. This wasn't your delicate Asian fish sauce made with careful attention to flavor balance. This was fish guts, salt and thyme, lots of thyme, combined in clay pots and left to decompose under the Mediterranean sun for several months until it achieved what Romans considered perfection. The process began with fish entrails, heads, scales, and whatever else was left after the good parts had been removed. These scraps were layered with coarse salt in large earthenware vessels, sometimes with herbs added for what we might generously call flavor enhancement. The mixture was then left to ferment in the sun for anywhere from 1 to 3 months, during which time the fish would break down into a thick, pungent liquid that could be strained and bottled. The smell, according to contemporary accounts, was overwhelming. Roman writers described it as powerful enough to clear a room, yet somehow irresistible once you acquired the taste. The best garum was made from tuna entrails and commanded prices that would make modern truffle oil seem affordable. A single amphora of premium garum could cost more than a slave, which tells you something about Roman priorities and possibly their sense of smell. But here's what made garum truly remarkable. Romans didn't just use it occasionally as a special condiment. They used it the way we use salt, pepper, and ketchup combined. It went on meat, vegetables, bread, and even desserts. Roman cookbooks from the period rarely mention a recipe that doesn't include garum. It was the foundation of their cuisine, the secret ingredient that made everything taste Roman. The production of garum was a massive industry. Entire coastal towns specialized in its manufacture, with rows of fermentation pots stretching along the shoreline like some ancient aromatic assembly line. The smell from these production centers was so intense that they had to be located downwind from populated areas, creating the world's first industrial zoning laws based purely on olfactory offense. Different regions produced different varieties. Spanish garum was considered the finest, made from tuna and mackerel caught in specific waters. Cheaper versions used whatever fish were available, and the absolute bottom shelf garum was made from fish scraps that other garum makers had rejected, which is a level of culinary desperation that's hard to imagine. The wealthy Romans were so obsessed with garum that they developed elaborate rating systems for different types. They had garum sociorum, the premium stuff made from tuna blood and guts. There was garum made from specific fish caught during certain seasons. Some varieties were aged for years, developing complexity like fine wine if wine were made from rotting fish. What's perhaps most remarkable is that garum wasn't just tolerated. It was genuinely loved. Roman soldiers carried it in their packs, merchants traded it across the empire, poets wrote about it with genuine affection. This wasn't survival food, this was comfort food, the taste of home for anyone who had grown up Roman. The decline of garum came with the fall of the Roman Empire, though versions of it persisted in various forms. Modern food historians who have attempted to recreate authentic garum describe it as intensely salty, deeply umami, and surprisingly complex, with a flavour that grows on you if you can get past the initial shock. Some compare it to a very intense anchovy paste, while others suggest it's closer to aged cheese in its complexity. Today, the closest thing we have to garum might be Worcestershire sauce, which actually contains fermented anchovies and follows some of the same basic principles. But even that comparison falls short of capturing what garum meant to Roman cuisine and culture. It wasn't just a condiment, it was a cornerstone of civilization, the liquid that held the empire together, one meal at a time. Chapter 2. Medieval Peacock, when dinner was also performance art. Moving forward in time to medieval Europe, we encounter a dining tradition that combined culinary ambition with theatrical spectacle in ways that would make modern dinner parties seem positively restrained. The roasted peacock, served with its feathers intact and often posed as if still alive, represents perhaps the pinnacle of medieval showing off through food. This wasn't just about eating an unusual bird. The peacock feast was a carefully orchestrated performance that began long before the first bite and continued well after the last guest had staggered home. It was dinner as theatre, cuisine as status symbol, and cooking as an art form that prioritized visual impact over anything resembling practical nutrition. The preparation of a medieval peacock dinner began with the careful removal of the bird's magnificent plumage. This had to be done with surgical precision because the feathers would later be reattached to the cooked bird. The skin was peeled away in one piece, keeping the feather pattern intact, while the actual bird was prepared for roasting. This process alone could take hours and required the kind of patience that modern cooks reserve for holiday turkeys, except infinitely more complicated. The peacock itself was then stuffed with a mixture that varied depending on the wealth and creativity of the host. Common stuffings included other smaller birds, creating a medieval turducken situation that could involve chickens, doves, larks, and sometimes even smaller peacocks. Spices were added liberally, not just for flavour, but because expensive spices were another way to demonstrate wealth. Saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were used in quantities that would bankrupt most modern households. The roasting process was an art form in itself. The bird had to be cooked thoroughly while maintaining its shape for the eventual feather reattachment. This required constant attention, careful basting, and the kind of temperature control that medieval ovens weren't exactly designed for. Cooks developed elaborate systems of rotating the bird, adjusting the fire, and monitoring the cooking process that resembled military operations more than food preparation. But the real magic happened during the presentation. Once the peacock was cooked, The preserved skin and feathers were carefully reattached, often with the help of small wires or wooden supports. The goal was to make the bird appear alive and magnificent, as if it had simply decided to lie down on the serving platter for a brief rest. The beak was often gilded with real gold leaf, and the eyes were sometimes replaced with precious stones. The presentation of the peacock was a ceremony unto itself. It was carried into the dining hall by a procession of servants, often accompanied by musicians, and sometimes even by costumed performers acting out scenes from classical mythology. The bird was placed at the center of the table like a centerpiece that happened to be edible, though eating it was almost secondary to admiring it. Guests were expected to react with appropriate awe and appreciation. The host would often make a speech about the magnificence of the bird, the skill of the cooks, and the honor of sharing such a feast with such distinguished company. Only after this ceremony could the actual carving begin, which was itself a ritualized process performed by the most skilled carver in the household. The taste, according to historical accounts, was actually quite good, though perhaps not worth the enormous effort involved. Peacock meat was described as similar to turkey, but with a slightly gamier flavour. The elaborate stuffing and spicing certainly helped, and the meat was often quite tender due to the careful cooking process. But let's be honest, by the time you got to actually eating it, the food was probably the least important part of the experience. The peacock feast represented everything about medieval noble dining, excess, display, and the transformation of basic sustenance into elaborate social theatre. It was a way for the wealthy to demonstrate not just their money, but their taste, their connections, and their ability to command the kind of resources necessary to turn a simple meal into a memorable spectacle. These feasts were so elaborate and expensive that they were typically reserved for the most important occasions, royal visits, major religious holidays, or significant political events. A single peacock dinner could cost more than most people earned in a year, making it the medieval equivalent of serving gold-plated caviar while your guests watched a private concert by the world's most expensive musicians. The tradition eventually faded as tastes changed and new forms of conspicuous consumption emerged. But for several centuries, the peacock feast represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval dining ambition, a reminder that humans have always found ways to turn the basic need for food into something far more complex, expensive, and socially significant than simple nutrition would require. Chapter 3. The Viking delicacy that doubled as survival food. Travelling north to the harsh landscapes of medieval Scandinavia, we encounter a food that perfectly embodies the Viking approach to life. Practical, intense, and slightly terrifying to outsiders. Harkal, or fermented shark meat, represents one of humanity's most successful attempts to make the inedible not just edible, but actually nutritious, and according to those who've acquired the taste, genuinely delicious. The story of Harkal begins with a problem that would have stumped most civilizations. How do you eat a Greenland shark when the fresh meat is literally poisonous? These massive sharks, which can live for centuries in the frigid Arctic waters, accumulate high levels of trimethylamine oxide in their flesh. When fresh, this compound breaks down into trimethylamine, which is toxic to humans, and gives the meat a smell that can only be described as aggressively unpleasant. Most cultures would have simply avoided these sharks entirely, but the Vikings weren't most cultures. Faced with long, brutal winters where food scarcity could mean the difference between survival and starvation, they developed a process that transformed this toxic meat into a preserved protein source that could last for months. The traditional preparation of Harkal was a masterclass in patience and faith in fermentation. The shark was first buried in gravel for 4 to 5 months, during which time the toxic compounds would break down and drain away. The gravel had to be coarse enough to allow drainage, but fine enough to create pressure that would help squeeze out the harmful fluids. The burial site was carefully chosen, usually on a hillside where natural drainage would carry away the toxins. After the burial period, the shark was dug up and hung to dry for another 4 to 5 months. This wasn't just air drying, it was a carefully controlled process that required the right combination of temperature, humidity, and air circulation. The meat was cut into strips and hung in special drying sheds that protected it from rain while allowing air to circulate freely. The result was a hard, cheese-like substance that could be stored almost indefinitely. The smell of properly prepared hakal is legendary among those who've encountered it. Descriptions range from intensely fishy to like being punched in the face by the ocean to what I imagine a mermaid's gym socks would smell like. The ammonia content gives it a sharp, penetrating odour that can clear sinuses from across a room. First-time tasters are often advised to breathe through their mouths and swallow quickly. But here's what makes hakal remarkable. Despite its challenging aroma and acquired taste, it was genuinely nutritious and practical. The fermentation process not only removed the toxins, but also concentrated the protein and created a food that was rich in vitamins and minerals. For people facing months of winter darkness with limited food sources, hakal provided essential nutrition that could mean the difference between health and scurvy, between strength and weakness. The preparation of hakal was a community effort that required knowledge passed down through generations. Families had their own techniques, their own preferred burial sites, and their own methods for determining when the fermentation was complete. The process was so important that it was often overseen by the most experienced members of the community, usually older women who had perfected the art through decades of practice. Different parts of the shark produced different qualities of hakal. The belly meat was considered the finest, with a softer texture and milder flavour. The tail sections were tougher, but lasted longer in storage. The liver was processed separately and was considered a particular delicacy, though it required even more careful preparation due to its higher concentration of toxins. The social aspects of hakal consumption were as important as the nutritional ones. Sharing hakal was a way of demonstrating hospitality and community bonds. Guests were offered the best pieces, and refusing hakal could be seen as an insult to the host's skill and generosity. The ability to eat hakal without flinching was a mark of Viking toughness, a way of proving that you belonged in a culture that prized resilience above comfort. Modern Icelanders still prepare and consume hakal, though it's now more of a cultural tradition than a survival necessity. It's often served during the midwinter festival of Thorrablot, accompanied by brennivin, a strong Icelandic schnapps that helps mask the intensity of the shark meat. Tourists often seek out hakal as a challenge or a cultural experience, though few develop a genuine appreciation for its unique qualities. Food scientists who have studied hakal describe it as one of the most successful examples of traditional food preservation techniques. The fermentation process that the Vikings developed through trial and error actually represents sophisticated biochemistry, transforming a toxic protein source into safe, nutritious food through carefully controlled decomposition. The legacy of hakal extends beyond its role as survival food. It represents the Viking approach to problem solving. Faced with an impossible situation, they didn't give up or look for easier alternatives. They developed a solution that was practical, effective, and sustainable. They turned poison into food, scarcity into abundance, and challenge into tradition. Today, hakal serves as a reminder of human adaptability and the lengths to which our ancestors went to survive in harsh environments. It's a testament to the power of traditional knowledge and the importance of preserving cultural practices that might seem strange to outsiders, but represent generations of accumulated wisdom about survival, nutrition, and community. Chapter 4: Ancient Egyptian Bread, when your daily bread included daily grit. Shifting our focus to the banks of the Nile, we encounter a staple food that sustained one of history's greatest civilizations, while simultaneously wearing down their teeth grain by grain. Ancient Egyptian bread was the foundation of their diet, their economy, and their social structure. But it came with a hidden cost that archaeologists are still discovering in the dental remains of mummies thousands of years later. Bread in ancient Egypt wasn't just food, it was currency, offering to the gods, and the measure of a person's wealth and status. Workers were often paid in bread rations, with different types and quantities indicating their position in society. The phrase bread and beer was essentially the ancient Egyptian equivalent of food and shelter, representing the basic necessities of life along the Nile. The process of making Egyptian bread began with emmer wheat, an ancient grain that was hardier than modern wheat, but also more difficult to process. The grain had to be ground by hand, using stone querns, large grinding stones that required significant physical effort to operate. This grinding process was typically done by women, who would spend hours each day reducing grain to flour, a task that was both essential and back-breaking. Here's where the story takes a gritty turn, quite literally. The stone grinding process inevitably introduced small particles of stone into the flour. No matter how carefully the grinding was done, tiny fragments of the quern stones would break off and mix with the grain. Additionally, sand from the desert environment would blow into the grinding areas and storage spaces, adding another abrasive element to the flour. The Egyptians were aware of this problem and developed various techniques to minimize it. They used sieves made from woven reeds to filter out larger particles, and they sometimes washed the grain before grinding to remove surface sand. But the technology of the time simply couldn't eliminate all the stone and sand particles, meaning that every loaf of bread contained a certain amount of what was essentially edible sandpaper. The baking process itself was sophisticated for its time. Egyptians developed various types of ovens and baking techniques that produced different styles of bread. Some bread was baked in clay molds that gave it specific shapes, often with religious or symbolic significance. Other loaves were baked on hot stones or in communal ovens that served entire neighborhoods. The variety of bread types was remarkable, with different grains, shapes, and preparation methods creating a diverse bread culture that rivaled modern bakeries. But regardless of the baking method, the fundamental problem remained. The bread was abrasive. Every bite contained microscopic particles of stone and sand that gradually wore down the teeth of anyone who ate it regularly. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a serious health issue that affected virtually everyone in Egyptian society, from pharaohs to peasants. Archaeological evidence from mummy examinations reveals the extent of this dental wear. Egyptian skulls show teeth that are worn down to the gums, with some individuals having lost most of their tooth enamel by middle age. The wear patterns are distinctive and consistent, showing the gradual grinding away of tooth surfaces that could only result from a lifetime of eating abrasive food. The social implications of this dental wear were significant. Tooth loss and dental pain would have affected people's ability to eat, speak, and function in daily life. It likely contributed to malnutrition in older individuals who could no longer chew tough foods effectively. The constant dental problems may have also influenced Egyptian medicine, which developed sophisticated treatments for tooth pain and dental infections. Interestingly, the quality of bread and the extent of dental wear varied by social class. The wealthy could afford finer grinding techniques and better sieving, resulting in bread with fewer abrasive particles. They also had access to softer foods that could supplement their diet, reducing their dependence on coarse bread. The poor, however, had no choice but to eat the grittiest bread and suffer the consequences. The Egyptians developed various strategies to cope with their abrasive bread. They often soaked it in beer or milk to soften it before eating. They created porridges and gruels that were easier on the teeth than hard crusts. They also developed a sophisticated understanding of dental hygiene, using various plant-based remedies to treat tooth pain and infections. Despite its drawbacks, Egyptian bread was nutritionally adequate and provided the calories and carbohydrates necessary to sustain a large population. The grain-based diet, supplemented with vegetables, fish, and occasional meat, supported the construction of pyramids, the development of writing, and the creation of one of history's most enduring civilizations. The bread also played crucial roles in Egyptian religion and culture. Different types of bread were offered to different gods, and the shape and preparation of ritual breads had specific symbolic meanings. Bread was included in tomb provisions to sustain the deceased in the afterlife, and the ability to provide bread was seen as a fundamental responsibility of rulers toward their subjects. Modern attempts to recreate ancient Egyptian bread have confirmed both its nutritional value and its abrasive qualities. Food historians who have ground emmer wheat using replica stone querns report that it's virtually impossible to avoid including stone particles in the flour. The bread that results is dense, nutritious, and noticeably gritty, giving modern eaters a visceral understanding of what daily life was like for ancient Egyptians. The story of Egyptian bread serves as a reminder that even the most basic foods can have hidden costs, and that the technologies we take for granted today represent enormous improvements in human health and quality of life. It also illustrates how civilizations adapt to the limitations of their technology and environment, finding ways to thrive despite challenges that might seem insurmountable to modern observers. Chapter 5. Chinese Century Eggs. When Patience Creates Delicacy. Traveling east to ancient China, we encounter a culinary tradition that transforms the familiar into the extraordinary through nothing more than time, chemistry, and remarkable patience. Century eggs, despite their name, don't actually take a century to prepare, but they do require a level of faith in the fermentation process that would challenge even the most adventurous modern food enthusiast. The creation of century eggs, also known as thousand-year-old eggs or preserved eggs, begins with a process that seems designed to test the limits of culinary trust. Fresh duck, chicken, or quail eggs are carefully coated in a mixture of clay, ash, salt, quicklime, and rice hulls, then left to cure for weeks or months until they undergo a transformation that would seem impossible if you hadn't witnessed it yourself. The traditional preparation method, developed over centuries of refinement, involves creating an alkaline environment that fundamentally alters the chemical structure of the egg. The quicklime and ash raise the pH to levels that would be dangerous in any other context, but which create the perfect conditions for the proteins and fats in the egg to break down and recombine in entirely new ways. During the curing process, which typically takes anywhere from 4 weeks to 5 months depending on the desired intensity, the egg undergoes changes that border on the magical. The white, or what was once the white, transforms into a brown, jelly-like substance with a consistency somewhere between firm gelatin and soft cheese. The yolk becomes dark green or black, with a creamy texture and a complex flavor that defies easy description. The appearance of a properly prepared century egg is striking enough to give pause to even experienced food adventurers. When cracked open, the egg reveals colors and textures that seem to belong more in a chemistry lab than on a dinner plate. The dark, translucent white has an almost crystalline quality, while the yolk appears as a dark jewel nestled within its transformed surroundings. But here's where century eggs reveal their true nature. Despite their intimidating appearance, they're actually quite delicious, at least according to those who've developed a taste for them. The flavor is complex and layered, with notes that food writers struggle to capture in words. Some describe it as creamy and cheese-like. Others detect hints of ammonia balanced by rich, savory undertones. The texture is smooth and custard-like, completely different from fresh eggs, but somehow familiar in its richness. The preparation of century eggs was traditionally a specialized craft, passed down through families and guilds of preservers who guarded their techniques carefully. Different regions developed their own variations, using different combinations of preserving materials and curing times to create eggs with distinct characteristics. Some areas were famous for producing particularly fine century eggs, and these regional specialties were traded across China like fine wines. The science behind century eggs is actually quite sophisticated, though the original developers worked through trial and error rather than chemical analysis. The alkaline environment breaks down proteins through a process similar to what happens in aged cheeses, creating new flavor compounds and textures. The high pH also prevents harmful bacteria from growing, making century eggs remarkably safe despite their unusual preparation method. Century eggs weren't just a curiosity or delicacy, they served practical purposes in traditional Chinese cuisine. They could be stored for long periods without refrigeration, making them valuable during times when fresh eggs were scarce. They were also believed to have medicinal properties, particularly for cooling the body during hot weather and improving digestion. The cultural significance of century eggs extends beyond their practical uses. They represent the Chinese culinary philosophy of transformation through patience, the idea that time and proper technique can create something extraordinary from ordinary ingredients. The willingness to wait months for eggs to cure reflects a different relationship with food than the instant gratification that characterizes much of modern eating. In traditional Chinese medicine, century eggs were classified as cooling foods, believed to balance the body's internal heat. They were often prescribed for people suffering from fever or inflammation, and they were considered particularly beneficial during the hot summer months. Whether or not these medicinal properties have scientific basis, the eggs certainly provided protein and nutrients that were valuable in traditional diets. The preparation and consumption of century eggs also had social dimensions. The ability to properly prepare them was a mark of culinary skill, and serving them to guests demonstrated both hospitality and sophistication. Different ways of presenting century eggs, whether sliced and garnished or incorporated into more complex dishes, reflected the host's creativity and cultural knowledge. Modern food science has confirmed that century eggs are not only safe, but actually quite nutritious. The curing process concentrates certain nutrients while creating new compounds that may have health benefits. The eggs are rich in protein, vitamins and minerals, and the fermentation process may create probiotics that support digestive health. Today, century eggs remain popular in Chinese cuisine, though they're now often produced using more controlled industrial methods rather than traditional clay coating. They're commonly served as appetizers, sliced and garnished with pickled ginger and soy sauce, or incorporated into congee, salads, and other dishes. For many Chinese people, they represent comfort food, a taste of childhood and cultural heritage. The story of century eggs illustrates humanity's remarkable ability to discover food possibilities in the most unlikely places. It shows how patience, experimentation, and cultural transmission can transform simple ingredients into complex delicacies. Most importantly, it reminds us that what seems strange or unappetizing to one culture may be a cherished tradition in another, and that true culinary adventure requires an open mind and a willingness to trust in processes we might not fully understand. Conclusion: the endless creativity of human hunger. As we reach the end of our journey through history's most bewildering banquet, it's worth reflecting on what these strange foods tell us about human nature, creativity, and the lengths to which people will go to transform necessity into pleasure, survival into culture, and the mundane into the memorable. Each of these foods, from Roman garum to Chinese century eggs, represents a solution to a problem. The Romans needed to preserve fish and enhance flavor in an age before refrigeration. Medieval nobles needed to demonstrate their wealth and status through increasingly elaborate displays. Vikings needed to extract nutrition from toxic sharks during brutal Arctic winters. Egyptians needed to feed a civilization using the tools and grains available along the Nile. Chinese cooks needed to preserve eggs and create delicacies that could last through changing seasons. But these foods represent more than just practical solutions. They show us how humans transform necessity into art, how survival strategies become cultural traditions, and how the simple act of eating becomes a way of expressing identity, creativity, and community bonds. The elaborate Peacock feasts weren't really about nutrition, they were about theatre, status, and the human need to turn basic functions into meaningful experiences. What's perhaps most remarkable is how these foods were not just tolerated, but genuinely loved by the people who created them. Garum wasn't just a way to preserve fish, it was the flavour that made food taste like home for millions of Romans. Hakal wasn't just survival food, it was a symbol of Viking resilience and community. Century eggs weren't just preserved protein, they were delicacies that represented patience, skill, and cultural sophistication. These historical foods also remind us how much our modern food system has changed the relationship between humans and their meals. We live in an age of unprecedented food safety, variety, and convenience. We can eat strawberries in winter, fish from distant oceans, and spices from around the world without thinking twice about the logistics involved. Our biggest food decisions often involve choosing between dozens of breakfast cereals rather than figuring out how to make poisonous shark meat edible. But perhaps we've lost something in this transition to modern convenience. The people who created these strange foods had an intimate relationship with their ingredients, their preparation methods, and their cultural significance. They understood food as more than just fuel. They saw it as medicine, art, social currency, and spiritual offering. They were willing to invest enormous amounts of time, effort, and creativity in transforming simple ingredients into complex experiences. The story of weird historical foods is ultimately a story about human adaptability and creativity. Faced with limited ingredients, challenging environments, and the constant threat of hunger, our ancestors didn't just survive. They innovated, they experimented, they created traditions that lasted for centuries and influenced cuisines that we still enjoy today. Some of these foods have disappeared entirely, victims of changing tastes, improved technology, or simple cultural evolution. Others have survived and adapted, finding new roles in modern cuisines or persisting as cultural traditions that connect us to our ancestors. A few have even experienced revivals as modern food enthusiasts rediscover ancient techniques and flavors. As you settle back into your modern kitchen, surrounded by the convenience and safety of contemporary food systems, take a moment to appreciate the long, strange journey that brought us here. Every meal you eat is built on thousands of years of human experimentation, failure, success, and the endless creativity that emerges when hunger meets imagination. The next time you encounter an unfamiliar food, whether it's something from another culture or just a dish you've never tried before, remember the Romans savoring their fermented fish sauce, the Vikings sharing their preserved shark, or the Chinese patiently waiting months for their eggs to transform. Remember that what seems strange to you might be someone else's comfort food, and that the history of human cuisine is written in the willingness to try new things, even when they seem impossible, impractical, or just plain weird. After all, someone, somewhere in history, was the first person to look at a shark that could poison you and think, "I bet if I bury this in gravel for a few months, it'll be delicious." And somehow, incredibly, they were right. May your own culinary adventures be slightly less challenging than those of our ancestors, but no less rewarding in their own way.